I think I'm starting. All right, so we've done this a couple times, but it's been different every time.
Yeah.
I just want to share first that I couldn't be more grateful to be in this kind of work with people like you and people like Stan and all the people who are on this Uniting Methodist coordinating team. It's a very odd grouping of people, and I'm not sure how we all got together, but I'm grateful that we are. And I just want to share a little bit about myself, my background, and piggybacking a little off of Stan's shoulder stories yesterday. You know, we do find ourselves standing on the shoulders of those who've gone before us, and there's nothing that can pave the way like that, like the people who have gone before you, who have paved the way for ministry for each of us, and we all have a different story of that, I'm sure, but for me, that pathway was pretty clear, and my dad was pastor and is still a pastor, and my grandfather and my great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather. I'm a sixth-generation United Methodist minister in my family, and just as Mark, there's also, you know, those others in each generation too, and so there's a clear pathway, but I didn't know it was mine until I'd graduated from college and began to work in the church. It just seemed natural. It seemed like what I was supposed to do, and it's where I'm comfortable. I've lived in the church all my life, and literally lived in the church all my life. And my kids know about this too. They're double PKs, which is a whole nother thing. And so, you know, growing up and living in the church, you kind of don't know any other way. And one of the beautiful things I learned as a PK is that this thing we call the connection is powerful. It is so powerful because I grew up and I think I just knew, perhaps I knew because of some of the people who came and went from our home, our parsonage at any given point. I knew that no matter where I found myself in the world, I'd have a home. And I knew that because I know that there's probably a Methodist pastor somewhere nearby. And because of what I know of my own family and the families of other pastors that I knew growing up, I knew that no matter where I go, I would have a home. And that if I was in trouble, I could look up the parsonage address and find my way to somebody who would help me. And like I said, I think I knew that because there were several people who came into our home. And for a period of time, needed to know that they were accepted. Maybe they needed to leave home in order to find someplace else to ask that question of acceptance. It may have been because they questioned their own faith. Sometimes it may have been because they were struggling to understand their own identity or their own sexuality. I can remember these stories of people coming into our home who were other PKs, and it was not a question at all that there was room for them. Never, ever, ever has there been a question that there would be room for someone else in our home. Because it's hardwired in us. It's hardwired in, I think, those who grow up as PKs. I'm generalizing. But we grow up on the shoulders of generations who paved the way for us. And I think that is true in our churches too. So taking that away from being a PK and just saying as a pastor, those of you who are pastors in the room, when you walk into a new church, into a new appointment for the first time, I think you begin to find out what the story is, what the history has been. And you'll find out real fast which stories really are shaping the community that's there right now. Because they'll tell you. They'll tell you the stories. Do you know about when this happened at this church? And that's why we are what we are today. so they'll begin to tell you the stories, and you learn about the people who have gone before you and the way that they have shaped the congregation for a period of time. Maybe for 4 years, maybe for 4 months. It doesn't take long to make an impression, depending on what it is. And so I'm currently serving at Oaklawn United Methodist Church. I'm very, very proud to be the pastor of this incredible church. Mark talked about how our story of Methodism really mirrors the American story, and we have at Oaklawn United Methodist Church a long history. It was founded in 1874, and well, in Texas, that's a long time. I did move to the Northeast for a while and learned that that's not so old, but and you know, then across the pond as well. But in Texas, that's old. And so I found myself learning stories of a church that has a long history in Dallas. And as a matter of fact, when it was built, it wasn't even in Dallas. Mm. And if you know where Oaklawn is, it's in the middle of Dallas. It's downtown Dallas. But at the time, it wasn't even in Dallas. Well, the culture, the community that surrounds any of our churches shapes and forms who that church is too, as it should. And so what happened over time is that the community that surrounds the space where Oaklawn United Methodist Church sits became really the epicenter for gay and lesbian people throughout the Metroplex. And really, if you think about it, that takes up a lot more than just the Metroplex. If you find yourself a gay or lesbian person over time in the North Texas area, it's the epicenter for you too. So this spot, this very small area of Oaklawn, became the epicenter for all gay and lesbian people in the surrounding area. And I think that we find in our history and our stories that there are highs and lows. There's blessing and there's pain. And there's a lot of blessing there. This story has been filled with people who built new communities, started new churches, helped new ethnicities find a way to build a new community within Dallas. And so there are so many beautiful ways that Oaklawn was about the work of building up new worshiping communities, developing disciples. But then there's also stories of pain. As the community began to be larger in the core of the church, and communities change and people move, and so as more and more of the gay and lesbian people were members of the church, they got to a point in the 80s where they said, we want to take a vote and make this actually a policy, that we are represented, that we have representation of gay and lesbian individuals that are on our leadership teams. It was a very sad and disappointing point in our history, and again, the points that really, really form a church because you hear the story over and over again. And this one I heard. They did take a vote, and it failed by an overwhelming majority. And 100 people left the church that day. Now, new communities were formed. Newness did happen. But the pain of that point in our history has shaped who Oaklawn has been for some time. So the pain shapes us, the beauty shapes us, and eventually I think we have to find ways to talk about what can heal us. And I think that over time, Oaklawn has done that in really beautiful ways. They've opened the door to every possible kind of group that would darken the doors. We have a wonderful homeless ministry. We have More than 75% of our membership are in the LGBTQ spectrum. And when you're appointed to any given context, you have to face the challenge and the question of how to be faithful to the people that you have been appointed to serve. And so in being appointed to Oaklawn United Methodist Church, I thought perhaps the best way to do this is just to get out there, to live in and among everybody who's walking up and down these streets, and to know who they are, and to know what is it that we can do for you. How can we be what you need us to be as a church in this neighborhood? But over time, I think that the beautiful thing that has happened with this congregation is that they have seen God in everyone around them. And that this thing called Ubuntu that Mark talked about begins to develop and really begins to shine through, where you say, I am because we are. And by the way, that means that we can't be without each other. We need one another, and that's true just in our local context, but it's true in our conference. And that's why I love to do this kind of work with Stan. We kind of represent two opposite ends of the spectrum if you're kind of looking from an overview. Well, maybe visually too. But if you kind of look at an overview of what our churches are in this conference, we kind of represent two ends of the spectrum. And I need him. I need him to be in this together with me. Because what his context needs is very different than what my context needs right now. And there are ways that I can be helpful to him and that he can be helpful to me. And if we're not in this together, then all that's a huge waste of the gifts and graces that God has given to us. And I want to say that no matter where I found myself as a child, I knew that something went before, that I was grounded in love and grace. I knew that no place that I went that I would be turned away. I had an expectation that love and grace would meet me at the door. I hope that everyone looks at Oaklawn and says, love and grace will meet me at that door. I have not been prejudged before I came. I will be accepted. I will be loved. I know that when I come into this place that I am loved. I'm not fearful that because I have dreads in my hair that I'll be turned the other way. I know that love and grace will meet me at the door because I know the love and grace that Stan has offered to me and that members of this congregation have offered to me. And this is the kind of work that I think we need to be about in encouraging our local churches, regardless of where they find themselves. I mean, Oaklawn is a mosaic. We have, yes, over 75% of our congregation are on the LGBTQ spectrum. However, we have gay Republicans, and we have lesbians who oppose doing marriage for same-sex couples. I mean, it's very confusing. It is not monolithic. And I'm sure none of your churches are either. And so this is why we need each other to do this work. And so I think Stan provides an opportunity for me to balance out. We have to have each other in order to move forward and to find a way forward. And I think that the answer isn't just everybody believing the same thing, but learning how to truly live and love together in our differences. And I'm grateful to be able to do that with Stan.
Thank you. Thanks, Rachel. Well, I too have enjoyed speaking with Rachel a couple of different occasions that we have had that opportunity. And we did come about this fairly organically, I think. There was a friendship before, but I think through our churches, it became apparent that we have two very different churches, yet we're both United Methodist churches. And we're two very different people. And I wished I had hair like Rachel. Someone told me I had the same hair I had when I was 16. Well, when you get it, you know you just got it. Somebody said I had Baptist hair, once combed, always combed. So, whatever. I do have a little hair envy, I must admit. Now, I'm going to say very quickly, because I did get to share last night a little bit about our church through Tom Shipp's story, but I do want to say that I grew up in rural East Texas, about 100 miles from here, in a little bitty church, Chandler United Methodist Church, a very proud church, a wonderful church, actually, a really wonderful church. I was blessed to be reared in that church, but unlike Mark and Rachel, there are no preachers in my family. We have a family of pharmacists. My grandfather was a pharmacist. My father was a pharmacist. God saw my chemistry grades and called me to preach. My sister's a pharmacist. But the church in our little town, and really all the churches in our little town, were the lifeblood of our town. You know, when we had Vacation Bible School, if you wanted to have any kids there, the Assemblies of God and the Baptists had to join in, or we just wouldn't have a crowd. So growing up with folk who had different theological perspectives is part of my upbringing, and part of my upbringing that I'm very proud of. And I started preaching when I was 16 years old. Felt the call to ministry before that, and so I went to college, Lon Morris College, Methodist School, Centenary College, Methodist School, and then to seminary, St. Paul School of Theology in Kansas City. Tammy and I married, and a week later, we were in seminary in Kansas City, a strange land. And we loved it. We loved the people that we met there. And we found out in seminary, too, that people come from different theological perspectives, and so do your professors. You know, what I discovered in the midst of that was that there were people that had made a big difference in my life. The shoulders thing, you know, the pastors who had led me to receive my call to preach, and also the professors. I mean, I love Tech Sample. I mean, I'm an evangelical, a Wesleyan evangelical. And I guess I lean very much on the traditional side theologically, and perhaps a little more progressively on the social side. And Tech Sample, I loved his accent, I loved his name, and I loved the subject of church and society. So I told my bishop when I get out of seminary, I want to go to some inner city church, because I'm going to do a PhD in social ethics and at American University and Wesley Seminary, and I had it all mapped out. And so the bishop sent me to Henderson, Texas as an associate. It wasn't that good. It was really great. And Tammy and I really did love it. I mean, it was a short 2 years. But in the midst of that, I developed a terminal form of leukemia. And so I was sent to First United Methodist Church in Houston, where I became an associate with Dr. Bill Henson at that great church. And I was treated at MD Anderson Hospital, and they said I had 3 years to live, and I've lived a lot longer on this side of that diagnosis than the other, so here I am. But I say that to say that Bill Henson and First United Methodist Church in Houston was a real turning point in my life. He and that church loved me to life. And I'm always thankful for that and that experience. Now, to those of you who know Methodist theologians, for me to say my mentors were Tech Sample and Bill Henson, now you know my problem. Because those two men couldn't have come from two more different perspectives And yet I told both of them that I loved both of them very much, and that if they knew each other better, they'd see how much they had in common. So after First Church Houston and to Tyler, on April Fool's Day, 1998, I became the pastor of Lovers Lane United Methodist Church. That was 20 years ago. And what I found here was a church that was struggling with its identity. I think I mentioned some of that yesterday, related to just who it was. And they'd had for 50 years 2 pastors, and then Bill Bryan came for a brief time, and the church was kind of just in, who are we? And it seemed like that for some years the church had been looking up the toll road or across their shoulders at other churches and wanting to be like them, instead of being who God had called us to be way back when we were opening the doors to alcoholics. And so we tried to start living into that. I went to General Conference one time as a delegate. That will be probably my last time. And that'll be all right with me. And it was 2004 in Pittsburgh. That'll cause you never to want to go back again. And that experience in Pittsburgh, it really shook me. Because I could see firsthand from the floor how divided the church was on this issue of human sexuality. I remember my mentor, he was kind of highlighted at that conference, in that Bill Henson had met one night some of the conservative folk and some of the more progressive folk. They met together and they talked, they fought, they tried to work things together. This was kind of one of those secret meetings. And I had coffee with Bill the next day, and he said, Brother Copeland, now when he would call you Brother Copeland, you knew he was going to come up with something that was very poignant. He said, I was told last night, Henson, the culture will bring the church to its knees. And he said, I thought the church's purpose was to transform the culture. And then he told me of the speech, the 800-pound gorilla speech, as I called it in the book I wrote about him. That he told me what he was going to say, and I tried to say, Bill, I don't think we're ready for this. And we weren't. Because for Bill, when he talked about amicable separation, it meant that the far left of the church should simply leave. And if that happened, everything would be okay. And I remember that some of Bill's closest friends that kind of scattered. I guess I did too a little bit, because he was like a lightning rod after that speech. We weren't ready to divide over the issue of human sexuality. You know about Bill, I want to say that just a few months after that, he had a brainstem stroke, and it killed him. And just taken away by death into the arms of God. But you know how sudden death leaves us all with unfinished business, things we wished we'd have said, or more calls we wished we'd have made. So that dialogue, I guess, has gone on with me since 2004. In 2005, this church did something. I guess I was still working through my grief. But this church had an ad campaign that was an evangelical ad campaign. The ad campaign was wannaknowwhy.com, and you'd go on that website and you'd click it, and a face would come up and a little tagline, and you could read that story of that member of Lovers Lane and what they were telling. And we had an African man named Peter Wieto, and we We featured him on a billboard, and people would click on wantoknowwhy.com, and they'd hear his story about how he was shot in Liberia and loaded up in a dump truck with 30 other bodies, and he was dumped on the beaches of Monrovia, and he wasn't dead, obviously, and he dug his way out. And when he went to his home the next morning, that home was burned to the ground, and they said that Betty and his 5 children had been killed. And so Peter fled to refugee camp, and Betty and 4 of the kids did survive, and they were in another refugee camp. Peter finds his way to Dallas and to Lover's Lane, and 2.5 years later, neither knowing the other was alive, a refugee family came and said, "We saw Betty and the kids." And those kids came and became part of this church. And when we told that story, African people started coming from everywhere, especially Liberians. And all of a sudden, this church was changing. And there were African seminary students at Perkins, and they said, let us help to form a multicultural African service here that we called Heart of Africa. And a few months after that, a Zimbabwean congregation said, could we have space here? And since then, they've become part of this congregation. This church was changing. We featured other their stories on that particular ad campaign. One of our people dealing with addictions, another who had been incarcerated, former offender, and special needs families, and people who were seen and their stories told started coming from everywhere. And we told one story of one man who was a doctor and gay. And he didn't say much about being gay, but he said, I never found the church a place where I felt welcome until I came here. And this church has opened itself up to me and my family. That's all that was said. And I can't point to one single other catalyst that led to the transformation of this church than to that ad campaign, because gay and lesbian people started coming to this church in numbers like we'd never seen. Our crosswalk service had been quite flat in attendance for some time. All of a sudden started growing. It was representative of the larger diversity of this church. And people weren't sneaking in. I was a good evangelical. I thought that we ought to have some sort of class that they go through, and then we need to interview them about their faith story, and then we would receive them into the church, and so that's how everybody was coming in. And we started hearing these stories from refugees from other nations, and we started hearing these stories from what I'm going to call refugees from churches. And they were talking about how these painful stories of the past and that they'd experienced in churches. Most of them not United Methodist churches, I want to say that. For the people who were coming here were conservative theologically. They were more conservative than I was. They didn't want to go down the street to another church. They wanted to come here because they sensed an evangelical approach. And some of them who had never had anything to do with the church were coming into the waters of baptism, just like the refugees from Africa. And just like those who were coming into our deaf ministry, and just like those who were coming across the street from our recovery ministry. And all of a sudden, when we started emphasizing baptism and people started getting into the waters of baptism, and we started seeing 68 to 70% of our new members coming by profession of faith in baptism, then we had an outbreak, an evangelical outbreak here. And I can't tell you how many times I wanted to talk to Bill, because I knew how his heart beat for the lost. There's some people here from Hazelhurst, Georgia, where he grew up. And I would tell him, because I did evangelism at First Church Houston, he was tough, demanding, and we delivered. We were bringing in 600 people a year at First Church Houston at that time, and it was exciting ministry. But he loved more than anything else when people came into the church by profession of faith and baptism. We're not just swapping Christians, he'd say. And I wanted to say, Bill, the Lord has blessed me with the church, and I don't know how it happened, but we're not just swapping Christians. There are people coming to faith. They're being baptized. They're coming from all over. They're coming from across the street in our recovery program. They're coming from our deaf ministry that we've started. They're coming from African nations. We've never seen anything like it. And Bill, they're coming from the LGBTQ community. That's a conversation that I'll never have. And I'll always wonder what he would say. I just want to say that what I have witnessed here, to all of you who may find yourself, as I am, a traditional compatibilist. We're not unicorns. They're all over the place. I've met herds of us. We want the main thing to be the main thing. And that's the mission of the church. Making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Traditionalists get scared when we start seeing theological differences that don't take seriously that mission. You know, you've seen all these blue shirts, loving all. The rest of that is the most important part. Loving all into relationship with Jesus Christ. And our vision is, this is the way we transform the world here at Lover's Lane. We want to be one diverse community. That's our goal. We're going to quit looking up the tollway and quit looking over our shoulder in the park cities. We're to be one diverse community. That's who we've always been at our best. Passionately engaging the Bible, uplifting Jesus in worship and loving service, and challenging in love that which divides. That's our vision. And our dream is too long for me to quote. I couldn't quote it anyway. You'll have to read it. And I want to close with a story. Because story leverages vision. When is Rachel, her church, 70% on the LGBTQ spectrum? That's not our story here. But I can tell you that we have a large number of people from that community. And they respect this church, who we are, as United Methodists. There was a couple of women who wanted to get married not too many months ago. And they wrote a letter. It said, we know none of you pastors can do this. We're not asking you to do that. We wouldn't want you to do anything that would be contrary to what your call is. We've got a preacher. And we know we can't have our wedding in the sanctuary of the chapel, but could we have it in that little house across the street? I don't break the covenant. And neither does our staff. We're in covenant not to break the covenant. Now, I had to write those women and tell them we couldn't have that wedding here. But before I did, I received another letter from one of these women, and she said, for 19 years, I'd left the church. And when I came into this church, I was loved immediately. I felt at home. I love this church, and it doesn't matter if we can't have our wedding there. I understand. Well, I decided to share the joy. And I wrote 6 of my strong lay families here, in leadership and financially supportive families here. And I had said, here's my problem. Here's their story. I had to tell them we can't do their wedding. Even over at the little house with some preacher that they probably got their ordination online. All 6 of those people wrote me back. One of them, my staff parish chairman, I can tell you that, he doesn't mind. He works for an oil company, and the conversation we'd had just a few days before, he wanted to show me a shotgun. It was a shotgun that had the Second Amendment in the barrel. We're not talking about a real liberal here, you know. He said, Stan, I got your letter. Me, and he called the name of his wife. They can have that wedding at our house. And the other 5 responded, how about our house? What about our house? And then I remembered that little song we learned, in Sunday school in Chandler. The church is not a building. The church is not a steeple. The church is the people. And even though right now we cannot have Laurel and Veronica's wedding here on church property, I found out that the church is the people, and you know what? They have property. I'm so proud of that couple who we had to pick and choose. And it was a wedding that I attended, and I told my congregation this story. I decided to share the joy not only with the 6, I wanted to tell the whole congregation this story. And I said, what would you do if you were their pastor? Yeah, I got a few letters. I had a few visits. But as I left on the benediction walking down the aisle, I said, I'm going to a wedding. I'm not performing a wedding. I'm not officiating. And I'm going because I'm their pastor. Friends, in this room, we have people who are theologically bent like Rachel and bent like me. And bent all the way in the middle and on either side of us. And this is the way I've known the United Methodist Church all my life. We cannot let the issue that has had us, as we've been reminded today, for 50 years, diverted from the main thing, diverting our attention from making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. We cannot let it continue to kill us. It has to be subordinated. We have to have local autonomy and make up our own minds. What evangelical would not want Rachel, with 70% of her congregation and the whole community that she's called to serve, not be able to serve with integrity? Not this one. Because loving those people into relationship with Jesus Christ is the main thing. So we've told our stories. And I think we got a question or two.
I don't know if
Hand
we
me
have a
that
question,
paper
but we
right
do
there.
have...
Somebody has sent questions.
Sorry, I forgot it. Thank you.
I think that one.
All right, so Stan, how can someone who still holds traditional views and feels comfortable with that move forward with the One Church plan?
Well, I think you move forward the way you're moving right now. You know, a reconciling church up the street did a wedding, and United Methodist pastors participated in it, and I didn't know about it for 2 months, 3 miles away. When our congregation found out about it, who cared? They'd already voted years ago to be the kind of church that they were. Now, I don't like the fact that they broke the covenant. But I do understand why they broke it. And so I think the big myth is that we're going to all have to vote. And I think we saw that this morning when this plan comes out. We don't all have to vote. In fact, I'm going to dare say 95% of the churches, maybe 99, are not going to vote. Don't have to, don't need to, don't want to. But we're going to say that a church in downtown San Francisco is different than a church in Hazelhurst, Georgia. And we're not all the same. We won't be all the same. So I think that we can live away from the fear and into the fact that this is allowing us to be the church where we're planted. I think Adam's discussion this morning on Scripture, this is beyond Scripture. I love the Bible. The Bible's the authority for me. But I believe William Sloane Coffin, I think he said that this is not a scriptural issue anymore. This is about what repulses you. And I think when you listen to Adam's presentation, you hear the depth of why it's important for us to engage Scripture, but we can't just single out this one thing and raise the bar so high. We're killing ourselves. And we're killing our future. And that's what I would appeal to traditionalists and evangelicals about. What's that church going to look like if it's traditional in 20 years? When we've missed a generation who are wondering, what are you doing? That's what I'd say.
All right, next one's for you too. With removal of the prohibition of gay marriage, does this leave traditionalist pastors vulnerable to discrimination lawsuits?
Discrimination lawsuits? I don't think so. I think we still have pretty strong separation of church and state deal. I mean, there was a guy that cooked a cake in Colorado, right? And the Supreme Court moved that he didn't have to bake a cake. I don't fear that for me or for others who would not do a wedding. I don't fear that. I know some people do. I think that's part of the conversation going on, but I don't fear that. I don't see the government forcing preachers to do what they're not committed to do or called to do. I just don't see that.
How do we shift the conversation to the people whose very lives are impacted?
How do we shift the conversation to people whose very lives are impacted by the discussion? We talk about the COWF and the One Church plan without ever mentioning LGBTQ. That is frankly wrong and is a contributing reason to why 50 years later we are still arguing. I disagree that this plan, as described, provides more balm than it does cause harm.
I think absolutely this conversation needs to be with and very much with respect to those who are deeply impacted and have been deeply impacted for many, many years. This causes great harm. And if you spend a little time in my church context, you'll understand that very well. It causes harm because to not be accepted anywhere is harmful. It is destructive. It is crushing. And what that does to the inner self of any individual is not anything that looks like God's love. Anybody who knows that feeling of being rejected knows exactly what I'm talking about. and we cannot be about that. We have been intentional about bringing folks into the conversation who more clearly reflect those on the LGBTQ spectrum today. I hope that you've heard from them why this matters. And I want you to hear from me as a pastor to a church full of people for whom this matters deeply, that this is progress. This is what we need. In the same way that Stan said that church down the street, it didn't matter for him here. He didn't even know about it. But I can tell you it matters to them. It matters to them that they honored the God-given gift of love that exists. It matters to them that they're able to honor God's calling in the lives of individuals who are no different than you and me, who are called into ministry. We bore witness in our congregation this past week to one such individual who preached this past Sunday and came as a gay man ready to pursue ordination in the United Methodist Church in spite of where we are right now. God is still at work. God will continue to be at work in and through everyone. And how dare we stand in the way of that?
You know, the only thing, I had a friend send a question to me via email the other day is, how do you think that we can possibly escape what's already happened to the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians? I wanted to say, well, when have we ever compared ourselves to the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians? But I know what he was talking about. I mean, we know that we're, the last big tent church, is that what we say, that hasn't gone through this division. I want us to quit looking backwards and start looking forwards. I'd love for us to be able to say, you know, the thing that I fear that the church, the altar I fear we're bowing out at, and what I think the culture has brought our church to our knees has been over division. This is a culture of division. And we have been brought to our knees, not by this issue, but by division, which is so contrary to our faith. What's it going to say to a world in need when the Methodists say, you know what, we know we're different. We have different mission fields. We have different theological perspectives. We don't even all like each other. But our Christ has called us to be one and to love. And we're going to do that, and we're going to see what message that sends to a divided world. We're going to see if that causes people to wonder what's going on with the Methodists. Maybe it's what it was dreamed about us being, that we would be known by our love. That can get beyond some of this other stuff. Don't know.